respondents said that their greatest challenge was in sort of how to manage the generalized anxiety of their employees. I thought that was really interesting. So it wasn't, the economic or the financial impacts of the crisis, but that was most challenging to them. It was, how do we help our employees and how do we manage their anxiety? And that certainly has been echoed in my sort of corporate clients as well. A lot of them are extremely well-meaning, but don't really know how to best help their employees through this time. Some other interesting stats. So these are some hot off the press, and you may have read about these. They were recently published just a few days ago in the various news media in Canada. Angus Reid put out the results of an interesting study last Monday, in fact, and they surveyed close to 2,000 Canadians, and over 50% reported a worsening of their mental health since this COVID crisis has started. And 10% specifically reported that their mental health has decreased a lot. Okay, so that those numbers for sure are concerning. We know that we have a mental health crisis in this country, as many countries do, even pre-COVID. So to think about that being exacerbated is worrisome. I read an interesting article yesterday that referred to the mental health crisis in Canada is the second curve that we have to flatten. I would agree with that. I'm seeing that in my practice as well. Like I said, I've never been busier. And I'm seeing two things. So the clients that I had that were struggling with anxiety and depression pre-COVID, there's definitely been an exacerbation of that during this time. So they're not doing so great. But also I'm seeing a lot of new anxiety, right? Even in people who don't have a history of anxiety or even depression, they're feeling really stressed during this time too, and understandably so. Of that 50% of Canadians who report a worsening of their mental health, 24% reported that they are mentally struggling, and 26% were classified as being the hardest hit by this COVID crisis. And what that means is that they were reporting that they were mentally struggling and financially struggling as well. Participants were given a list of emotions, and they were asked, how have you felt in the past 2 weeks? And they were allowed to choose up to 3 responses. And the most common responses were, I feel worried, that was 44%, anxious was 41%, and bored was 30%. And that I'm also definitely seeing in my practice as well. That resonates with me. In terms of the impact of mental health and mental wellness in the workplace, I'm sure you all know that this is a huge problem, again, pre-COVID. The economic impact of mental illness and mental stress costs us, is it $51 billion a year in lost productivity. 500,000 Canadians miss work every day because of a mental health issue. That number is staggering to me. No matter how many times I sort of relay that stat, it's still unbelievable to me that 500,000, and again, this is pre-COVID, 3 out of 4 short-term disability cases are related to mental illness or mental health. Employees who report that they are very stressed at work or that they're experiencing anxiety in the workplace are 3 times more likely to develop depression as compared to employees who report feeling just mildly stressed at work. Okay, so some data just to illustrate, and just in terms of numbers and putting a quantitative measure around just how big of a problem mental illness, mental health can be in the workplace pre-COVID. Okay, so and considering that, half of Canadians are saying that their mental health has worsened post-COVID, this is really something I think that we need to address. And that is especially true of, mental wellness in the workplace. A couple of weeks ago, the Canadian Mental Health Association actually put out 6 recommendations as to how employers can help their employees manage COVID-related anxiety. So I just want to share those with you. So the first recommendation they make is have a plan. Okay, so let employees know that you are thinking ahead, that you have a plan, for example, in terms of returning to work. So specifically, what is that going to look like? What does that mean for your team members, for your employees? Um, what if they want to take some time off? What if they want to return, part-time? What if they do feel anxious, as many, right? 65% of Canadians are reporting, yes, that they are really worried about returning back to work. So have a plan as to how you are going to manage that and address those concerns and share that with your employees. Number 2, sort of related to that, is communicate, share, and be open. So let your employees know that they can expect regular updates from you. Okay, so communicate to them even if you don't have any new information to impart. Keeping those open lines of communication with your team members is so important. And look to foster an environment where they feel comfortable speaking to you as well. Okay, the third recommendation is empathize. So empathize, share with your team members that you know that this is a stressful time. Recognize and that it's okay to feel stressed. It's okay to feel anxious, and sort of validate that, that they're not alone in feeling that way. And share any resources that might be available to them or that they can use, that they might have at their disposition, and encourage them, right, to use those resources. The fourth recommendation is to provide reassurance as best you can. So sticking to any factual information that you have that you can share with them can go a long way in reducing anxiety, because a lot of the anxiety around this COVID relates to feeling a great uncertainty about it, right? And when you offer reassurances by providing factual information, that can help to reduce uncertainty, right? And when you reduce uncertainty, you reduce, in turn, anxiety as well. The fifth recommendation they made is understand. So, understand that stress can become unmanageable in some of your team members, that it can lead to anxiety, and that they might need some extra encouragement in terms of encouraging them to engage in self-care. Reassure them that it's okay to do so. Not only that, but maybe even better is to model that for them, right? So understand, in other words, these are difficult times, and encourage your team members to do whatever they need to do in order to best take care of themselves. And then the last recommendation is, recognize that this is not quite business as usual, and that employees, your team members, are going to have to adjust the way they work, the way they do things, their expectations of maybe what can be done and how and under what conditions need to be adjusted as well. Know that things will not go perfectly. We're talking about returning to work. There's going to be kinks in that process as well, and that's okay. That's just, I think, an opportunity just to reevaluate things and tweak return to work plans if necessary. But know that that's not going to go perfectly, and I think it's important to impart that to your team members as well. That's to be expected. That's not the problem, but know that or share with them that you will be there for them along the way, right, to help ease the transition. I think can go a long way in helping to ease some anxieties about returning to work as well. Um, and we're talking about how to support your team members and employees in terms of their wellness. But what I always stress to team leaders is that in order for you to be able to do that well, you do truly have to start by taking care of yourself. And it's really easy when we're really busy, and in this time of crisis especially, you're having now to deal with so many things that you haven't had to deal with before. And it's really easy when so much is going on for sort of self-care to fall to the wayside, right? Or to push that aside. But the old adage, right? You truly cannot take care of other people if you don't take care of yourself first, right? It's that old oxygen mask metaphor. You have to put yours on first before you can help someone else who needs help. And that's especially important then to think about now. And if you're all very busy, as I'm sure many of you are, you're going to have to schedule in and prioritize time for self-care. Otherwise, you run the risk of it just not happening, right? And so important to do that. And that might mean that you need to change your mindset around self-care. It's not selfish. It's not indulgent or anything else that sort of negative that people tend to tell themselves sometimes about self-care, especially taking it in busy times. But change your mind frame. It's not a would be nice during these times, but it has to be an absolute necessity. And again, I think could really go a long way in terms of modeling to your team members what they're going to have to do now, but also in preparation for returning to work. And when we all return to somewhat of a semblance of normalcy, that's going to have to continue as well, right? And if you model that for them, I think that's going to have. We're good? Okay. I'm happy. I mean, we could talk about stress management techniques if you like, but maybe at this point, I'll turn it over to you, Deborah, to see. I can't see if any questions have come through, or just open it up to the audience if there's anything that you want to ask me about anything that I've said so far.
Why don't I start, because people will start thinking of questions and they'll put it in the chat. One of the things I'm curious about is what are you hearing from both the leaders you've been speaking with? I mean, other than these generalities, which are fantastic. But what are the concerns of some of the senior leadership among your clients?
The thing I'm hearing most of, well, they're stressed too, right? They're stressed, they're anxious, because now they're being stretched into various, directions that they haven't been stretched before. They're having to do things, or even tread into areas that they haven't before. And they're expected to maintain a poise of calm, right? And exhibit that and transmit that, and have all the answers when they might not necessarily have all the answers, or when they might necessarily be feeling so calm. But they're expected, to present that way. So in other words, just a lot of stress, right? A lot of stress is being experienced and certainly relayed to me by senior leaders. And this feeling that they're in this alone, because they are leaders, right? Because they're expected, again, to have all the answers. It's sometimes hard, right, for people who are at the top, so to speak, to get the support they need, right? Because they have to invest everything into taking care of others.
And this is something that I've talked to, we as an HR group have talked about that, HR is often the center of the organization in terms of taking care of the people. And so who takes care of them? And so what advice do you have for the leaders?
Yeah, this is, as it's always important, of course, to think about and focus on self-care, but never more so important than it is now. Um, think about, what does stress management mean to you? What is a relaxing activity to you? What recharges you, right? Because that's so subjective. And however you answer that, ensure that you schedule in the time every day to do some of those things, right? You do need to schedule and block it off in your calendar, because if you don't, again, you run the risk of those things not happening, right? Or dedicating the time to them. um, Lean on one another, right? I encourage my senior leaders to check in with their peers or their colleagues, to have, just off the record, right? Informal discussions of, you know, the fact that this is hard, and talk about, their struggles, and maybe, share with one another how one another has been coping, right? And some ideas as to how to cope. But it's also just nice to have that kind of peer-to-peer support, because that validates, right, how they're feeling, and it helps to normalize how they're feeling as well, right? As senior leaders, again, you're sometimes expected to be this, right, this sort of this beacon of hope, present this presentation of calm. And that's hard to do if you're not actually feeling that way yourself. And so to have an outlet where you can just, talk about freely how you are feeling, um, I think can be really helpful, just again, to normalize all of the emotions that are normal to be feeling during this unprecedented time.
The interesting thing, and I see this a lot in my coaching, so I'm wondering your opinion of this. I mean, how do you get leaders who are supposed to be all-knowing and in control to kind of accept and share their vulnerability, especially if it's something that they have always believed that, as you said, they're the center. So what advice do you have for leaders, and especially this HR group, um, maybe to advise their leaders on how to go to accept that vulnerability is not a weakness?
It is not a weakness, right? So that's the first thing I would work with them on, is we need to um, sort of reframe this idea that, feeling anxious, scared, worried, angry, sort of whatever emotions people might be feeling during this time, they are completely normal, right? So I would impart that they're normal, and to validate that, and not, it's not a sign of weakness at all. It's just a sign that they're human. So first thing, we need to change the meaning of what it feels to, or what it means to feel, quote unquote, more negative emotions. Secondly, showing that vulnerability is not weakness, because what we know now, right, from even the most recent research that has emerged in the past few years, is that team members, employees, will trust leaders more if they deem them to be authentic, right? And so what does that mean, right? To be an authentic leader? Well, it means to be authentic, means to be honest and to be true, and included in that is to share, right, to show vulnerability. That in part defines, or at least how employees define, what an authentic leader is. So this idea that showing vulnerability somehow is weakness, and it's going to, weaken your position as a leader, factually, that's just not true. In fact, the opposite is true, right? That it can actually render you more, more of a believable, credible leader, and therefore, you're going to, if your team trusts you more, you're also going to get a better version of them as well, right? We know that teams who trust their leader, treat teams who feel like they're being led by an authentic leader, actually are more productive, they're more creative, they function more efficiently. So again, I would just work with leaders to just challenge this idea that feeling anything that they deem negative is a weakness, because that's not true. And there's actually no such thing as negative emotions. Emotions just are. And then sort of get them to challenge this notion that somehow showing weakness is vulnerability, because in fact, the very opposite is true.
We have some questions. If somebody called Meat on Meat, if you want to ask your question, I don't know who that is. People have funny screen names. Meat on Meat.
Meat on meat.
If you want to unmute. Oh, maybe I'll ask it. Maybe they don't want to talk. So the question is, what are some of the best practices you've seen in organizations that have or are preparing to return employees to work? So what might you be seeing among your clients around this mental health and preparing them psychologically, especially with that overriding fear of, will I catch it? You know, I have to take transit, or even if I'm in the workplace, will I feel safe no matter how much you employer has put into place to keep me safe?
Yeah. So what I've seen some of my clients, the corporate clients, do really well so far, um, in preparing to work is that sort of two things. Number one, they have a good, solid, comprehensive plan in place. And number two, they are doing an amazing job of communicating that with their employees almost on the daily. They're really doing those two things well, such that, you know, if employees have any questions about, okay, but how is this going to work, right? So because they're keeping those lines of communication open and communicating in some form or other with their team members daily, it offers the employees just an easier venue for raising those questions and having them answered, and therefore reducing any anxiety that they have, right, about the uncertainty about returning to work, right? So the more, again, that communication is so important. Have the plan, communicate that to your employees, keep those lines of communication so that they can ask you any questions about them. And recognize, validate, again, that, right, what the Canadian Mental Health Association was recommending, validate and emphasize that you know that they are going to feel anxious, or at least a great majority of them are. Um, Validate that that is completely normal, but remind them that you are there to help them every step along the way. And not just, you know, when everybody gets back to work, but beyond that as well. And, you know, in part that they can come to you at any point if they feel, for whatever reason, that, you know, they need maybe extra supports at work, or the conditions aren't conducive to them, you know, working safely or calmly. But in order to do that, you really do, again, need to foster this open, transparent, sort of way of communicating with them, and vice versa.
I'm going to go out of order because I'm just going to try and link the questions that are logical. So Greg, do you want to ask your question because it builds on this? And I've got your question, and Laura, I've got yours. So
thanks. Hi, Gina. I was curious, the people that are coming back to work are going to be feeling stressed and anxious, and yet the middle managers that are the ones that are bringing them back with these new social distancing guidelines. There's millions of people in North America that have been furloughed. That's going to be a stressful startup activity by itself. How are companies sort of helping these middle, or have you heard any good practices around helping these middle managers both trying to do stressful work at the same time feeling anxious? Because I know in a lot of organizations that burden really falls onto that director, manager, middle manager group, and the executives sort of have to help that group through the process.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, the companies who are doing a good job at this are, first of all, validating everything that you're saying and recognizing just the difficult position, right, that that sort of middle management layer is facing. They're really having to do some tough work, right? And stressful work, and work that nobody wants to do. So they're recognizing that, first of all, that this is tough work. They're offering them additional resources and supports in order to help them through this time. Like for example, without sort of naming the companies, a lot of them have asked me to speak to their middle managers. So with one of them, everybody who's at the manager / director, sometimes VP level. And so speaking to them, talking to them about stress management. So in other words, bringing in even external resources if required, getting them whatever help that they need in order to manage their own stress and their own anxiety, so that they can then help, right, to manage the anxiety and the stress of their team members and those who report into them. So that the companies who are doing well are doing that. So the recognition, the validation of how they're feeling, and then offering them whatever supports they need in order to do the tough work that they need to do.
Thank you.
Anne, do you want to ask your question?
Thank you. Hi, Gina. I know it says Sohini. I'm not. I'm Anne. Nice to meet you. So you've probably answered this question in a number of different ways, but when you're dealing with employees who have small children at home, who they're homeschooling, and they're also trying to do some work at the same time throughout the day or in the evening after the kids go to bed, the stress and anxiety and uncertainty they must be feeling is huge. And oftentimes they don't know how to express it. But we've also heard that schools may not be opening till 2021. And if such is the case, the return to work for parents with small children is not going to happen until their kids return to school. How would you recommend we as leaders manage that in the longer term? Because I think that this is going to carry out much longer than the return to work, whenever it may be.
Right. Right. So recognizing that, this situation, this uncertainty might persist, right, even longer than we thought it was going to. And as leaders, I think that's where, you really do have to empathize with everybody's individual situations, and know that you might have to, again, change your expectations of what employees can do and under what conditions. So the ones that, that you described, who have small kids, who have to maybe work from home for a bit longer, maybe allow them to do so, right, if it makes sense, or offer them any additional resources that they might need in order to continue to do everything that they need to do, right? Because that's very stressful. So someone who's working, full-time, small kids at home, are often, putting the kids to bed, or dealing with their online education. So now they're teachers, they're employees, they're caregivers, they're being stretched in all these different directions. We know that, people in that very situation have reported that they work 4 hours more on their work day in terms of their job, 4 hours more than they normally do when they're, physically in the office, or when kind of life is going on as usual. So incredibly stressful, right? So recognizing that, right? Empathizing with that, and know that, the return to work, to the physical office, full time, that's not going to be the standard template for everybody. And you're going to have to make some adjustments depending on, people's individual situations at home, and adapting and adjusting to those, I think, is really important.
Thank you.
Laura, did you want to?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, I can.
Sorry, you went quiet. Hi, Gina. Mine's pretty quick, and I just want to ask if you've got any recommended reading so we can build our skills around this, because I'm sure this is a huge topic, and you're scratching the surface right now with everything you know.
For
so
sure.
anything you can recommend?
Which aspect of it in particular?
Like anxiety in the workplace.
Anxiety in the workplace. Yeah. Okay. So Canadian Mental Health Association, if you want a Canadian context on this, is amazing. They actually have, it's on their website, and they have a separate website dedicated just to workplace wellness. They're incredible. So I would point you there to start. If you subscribe to Forbes, although it's American, I still think, you know, the recommendations translate. Forbes and the Harvard Business Review, as of late, have published numerous articles on this very topic. So how to support employees, how to manage COVID-related anxiety specifically in the workplace. And if you want to maybe add me to LinkedIn, if we're not already connected, I can even send you some of those articles as well. They're really great. Yeah. So I'd say, you know, on the American side, they've done a nice job, and really Canadian Mental Health Association has done a wonderful job of publishing resources on this, as has CAMH. Actually, they have a workplace wellness section. It's on their website as well, that have some great tips there as well.
Thank you.
Lorraine, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi, thank you. And thanks, Gina, for hosting this session for us. Working for a New York City-based employer, we are struggling right now with encouraging our workforce to take time off, not only to relieve anxiety, but just to disconnect, because I don't know about you, but we're finding that work life certainly intersects with home life, and there's no boundaries, right? So taking time off is something we're encouraging, but with stay-at-home orders still in place, and travel not being really safe right now, we're struggling with encouraging our people to take it and actually having them take it. And what we're trying to avoid is, once the restrictions loosen and people are able to return to the workplace, we can't afford, from a business perspective, to have everyone take their time all at once. So looking to see if there's any creative solutions that you've heard of that you recommend to actually get people to take some vacation.
Yeah. Well, one thing, I think senior leaders can do is actually do that themselves, right? So model that behavior first, to know that this truly sends the message that it not only is this a good, healthy thing to do, but it is truly okay, right? And so to model that. Just, again, iterate the importance, right, of self-care. We can't, fly anywhere or take vacations like we used to, but I'm suggesting to some employers that they encourage their staff to take not vacation days, but take mental wellness days, because you recognize, just how stressful this time has been, especially the ones who, right, are, say, managing multiple roles at home. So, you sort of validate that this is a stressful time and encourage them to take the mental wellness days, in order for them to be able to continue to do everything that they need to do. And it will also better, I think, position them if they, take those days for themselves to eventually return back to work, right? Because you would like to return back to work, ideally, in as less of a stressed, manner as possible. And so taking some time off now, right, within the frame of mental wellness, can go a long way in helping people just to better prepare themselves for returning to work as well. So I would say that model the behavior for them, take those days, for yourself. Make sure if you do, you're not answering any emails, right? It's truly, this is a mental health day that you as a senior leader is taking, and then help your employees to sort of reframe how they're thinking about taking the time off, right? And just helping to dispel any maybe negative associations that they have with doing so, right? Especially given that they're so busy, right? Reframe it. That's something that it's not something that they really need to feel guilty about, right? It's not indulgent. In fact, it's the opposite. It's almost, it's the responsible thing to do.
Lorraine, does that help, or do you have a follow-up?
No, that helps. Thank you.
Great. Annie, would you like to ask your question?
One of the reasons that employees might be feeling anxious now is because they have all these deadlines and expectations that they're trying to meet. Are you seeing that managers or senior leaders are thinking about changing those performance expectations to reduce the employees' anxieties?
Yeah, some of them, right? So, I mean, it would depend on the individual situation, but for sure, if it makes sense too, it might mean, right, that you need to make some tweaks, right, or make some changes in whatever plans you've already drafted up so far, right, in terms of returning to work. I think, you know, if you operate with that overarching mindset, right, that yes, there's all these things you have to do and some deadlines you have to meet, but just give yourselves, right, the permission. I think if you could give yourselves as an organization the permission to be flexible with that, I think that'll help to reduce some of the anxiety and stress as well, right? Knowing that you have a permission to tweak and change plans if it makes sense to do so, right? And I think that, you know, that flexibility is actually important during this time, right? Always, but especially now, because having this idea that, you know, I have to do X, Y, Z, well, what if it doesn't work out that way, right? What if things change? What if, you know, goodness forbid, I don't know, 10 people become infected in your organization? Well, there goes the plan, right? So you have to give yourselves permission to be flexible in whatever plans that you've drafted thus far. And I think, you know, on a more personal note, just allow yourself some compassion with that as well. You all have very difficult jobs, and for sure there's a lot that you're having to manage through this, and especially, you know, as we think of returning to work. So know that, you know, that's not going to go perfectly. It's to be expected, and that's okay, right? So be a bit more self-compassionate towards yourselves, realizing you're in a difficult, stressful position, and yeah, it's okay to tweak the plan as you go along.
Can I just build on and ask you, Gina, to talk about control? I know one of the things that we've been talking about, a way that people reduce anxiety, is to feel they have some control over their environment and over their lives. Can you talk about how leaders, either now or returning to work, can impart that sense of control to people? And do you agree that if they have some control, it's helpful? They have
Control, yes, a sense of control is helpful, right? When people, because conversely, when people feel out of control, that tends to increase anxiety, right? And, you know, even through this COVID crisis, a lot of the I think behaviors that we've seen in terms of how people have attempted to cope with this are really just attempts to gain some control over this, you know, very uncertain situation. We've seen people take even some extreme measures, right? We've all seen the pictures of the grocery stores that have been raided, right? So people have sometimes gone to these extreme sort of ways of, really what they are is they're trying to manage or gain some control over what's happening. So does control help to reduce anxiety? Yes, but there is such a thing as, you know, trying to over control a situation. That's not actually going to reduce anxiety. That's not going to be helpful. That will actually exacerbate anxiety over time, right? So control, you know, control is a funny word. So what I would say, you know, about that is, and for yourselves, think about, you know, what you're worrying about or what's stressing you, and ask yourself, is this actually something that's within my control, right? Because not everything always is. And sometimes we try to control things that are actually completely outside of the realm of our control, that we can't actually do anything about, right? So that's a kind of a magic question I have people ask. So is what you're thinking about, what you're worrying about, what you're stressed about, is it actually within the realm of your control? And then I ask a second question, and is it important to you? Because depending on how you answer those two questions, that will dictate what you can do next in a healthy, productive manner, right? So for example, if you're worrying about something that's actually within your control, but at the end of the day, you say, okay, but it's not actually that important to me. Well, then the thing to do is you got to learn how to let that thing go, right? Because, okay, it's in your control, but if it doesn't matter all that much, why would you expend resources and energy on, right, trying to sort of change that thing? If something is within your control, and it's sort of not within your control, but it is important to you, well, that's when you have to then engage in, stress management techniques, right? Because if you can't change the situation because you don't have any control over it, then you do have to work on changing your response to that, right? Yeah. So the actions or healthy actions to take are really going to depend on whether or not something truly is within your control. And I think that's that's a big magic question, because so often, like I said, I see people working so hard, right, and trying to change things that they don't actually have any control over. And therefore it's misguided energy. And trying to do that, right, trying to change something that you actually can't action is just going to increase your anxiety over time. So my long-winded answer to say, yes, control can help to reduce anxiety if you are actually controlling something that you have control over. Otherwise, it's going to have the opposite effect.
Great. Cindy, I think you have a very important question. Can you ask it?
So my question was around death, and how have some of your clients dealt with death or deaths in their team, other than just the normal sort of grief counseling, EAP, etc.? Is there anything else more that we could be doing?
Yeah, I mean, those things for sure. So it would depend on, I think the answer to that would depend on the individual. I have had a client where this was very true. So one of their team members fell really ill. They didn't die, but it came close. They were in the intensive care unit. And my client specifically was actually feeling some guilt over that, because he wondered whether or not he was responsible, say, for putting some, extra stress on this employee, given some of the things that he was working on, and whether or not, he was indirectly responsible for, him contracting this illness because of stress, which might have triggered a reduction in his immunity response. So that, and I obviously had to work with him on helping him to manage that anxiety. If that happens on one of your teams, and of course I hope it does not, then if you, right, are finding that you're having a really hard time managing it, then that's when I would suggest, okay, maybe you do want to speak to somebody about other ways of managing your emotions around, right, what is happening or what has happened to this team member, because you shouldn't have to deal with that on your own. That's a hard thing to do. And sometimes, the EAP resources or any other resources that you might have at your disposition within your organization just are not quite enough, and that's okay too.
Thanks. Anne, do you want to ask your question?
Thanks, Deb. Gina, we know that there are going to be some policies that will need to be changed as we move forward. Sick, travel, vacation, wellness, health, and safety. What recommendations would you have in terms of perhaps dealing with the anxieties of policies changing within an office environment when there is so much other change that's happening already? And how do you put that all together to, what's the communication look like? What can you recommend?
So, first thing I would say, anticipate that these changes are going to happen, right? That you're going to have to make them, rather than sort of wondering about them, like wondering if they're going to happen, right? Rather than sort of framing them as what ifs. Agree and come to an acceptance that it's not a what if, it's going to happen, right? It's not an if, it's a when, right? But it will happen. So the more I think you come to that acceptance, it'll actually be easier to, I think, to manage if you make it a certainty rather than a possibility, right? It's unrealistic to think that you're not going to have to make those changes, right? Because we don't necessarily know what we're walking into, right? In terms of returning to work, what the next, few months, what the next year is going to look like, despite the nicest, cleanest, tightest of plans. The reality is that we don't really know how it's going to play out, right? So expect and know that you're going to have to, again, make some changes, right? In plans, in policies, in procedures. Make that a certainty. I think, secondly, that piece that I mentioned earlier about self-compassion is really important here. Don't expect perfection from yourselves. This is not the time to expect it. I mean, I would say not ever, but especially not now, right? It's you're being much too hard on yourselves to expect that any plans, procedures, etc., are going to fan out perfectly, or that you should perfectly execute them. That is way too much pressure to put on yourselves. I think, communicating wherever possible with your peers, having that peer-to-peer support is so important, right? As sort of Greg said earlier, you are managing team members, and perhaps you are being managed, right, from above. And so being in that kind of middle, it can be really, really stressful, because who do you turn to? I'd say, you turn to your peers, people who really understand what you're going through and how hard it is to, navigate now this new reality. And so give yourselves the permission and freedom to lean on one another, just to talk about how you're feeling, but also, can give one another ideas as to how to manage it, etc. But I think it's so important that you set up, right, before you return to work, set up some kind of forum where you can talk to your peers about how the return to work is going, and how you're doing, just in terms of managing everything that's associated with that.
Thanks. Greg, another question? Good question.
Hi, Gina. This is going to blend a bit from just HR into general management, and it's about dealing with sales teams. We've all got revenue generators in our organizations. We all know they're often cut from a different cloth. Their compensation is often highly variable, and they may have not been making any income or very little income. And they're also the people that sort of have the burden now of bringing business back into the organization so the rest of the organization can be working. So I sort of feel extra weight on the shoulders of the sales leaders and the sales teams. And have you heard of anything sort of different than what you've said that applies to the whole organization? Anything unique to that group?
Yeah, they, to your point, are under a lot of stress, right? They're, for lack of a better word, are being, considered like they're the potential money makers, right? And where generally sales tends to be sort of a high pressured position to be in anyway. Yeah, it can be, especially now, because organizations are putting, so much on these individuals to, get the business going again, and are asking them, to do things that they haven't done before, and to work, twice as hard. And that is a lot of pressure. So I would caution organizations against doing that, because you don't want those salespeople, if they're, especially because they're so important, right, to regenerating revenue, you don't want those folks to burn out, right? And that's, I think, something really, really important to pay attention to and look out for. A couple of weeks ago, Mark Cuban said something, and I just thought this was such a great quote. And he said, the way in which organizations treat their employees through this crisis is going to define their brand for the next decade. I'm like, that is so true, right? We have to be really careful how we treat, especially, employees in these already very stressful positions. Be very careful how we treat them. And careful in terms of the potential stress, that we might be putting on them, and the expectations that are placed upon them. You do not want these folks to burn out, because then what happens if, we know the stats, right, in terms of workplace stress, and, do you want them to go on disability, and what that is going to cost an organization. So in other words, if stressing them out, okay, so you might pay a little bit now if you ease up some of the expectations on them in terms of, okay, lost revenue, but that's going to cost you 3 times the amount later if you burn these folks out. So do you want to pay for it now, or do you want to pay for it later, right? So I think organizations have to think about the cost of potentially burning out some of their sales folks as well, and being really, really mindful, and check in with these folks and make sure that they're doing okay.
I think it's going to be a very fine line that you're going to have to monitor on a daily, weekly basis with the sales organization. Yeah. And the success is not getting quick revenue. It's going to be getting the whole organization through this and back to a point of stability.
For sure. And that's right. It's not a sprint, right? That's a marathon. Yeah.
Thank you.
Barry, you had a great question. Thank you. If you could ask. Are you still here, Barry? Maybe you can't find his unmute button. Okay, I'll ask it because we're near the end. So what can we do for companies that are not doing all they could for staff, some are still requiring staff to come to work, even if they could work from home. They're not providing sufficient PPEs, and they're taking an attitude of come in or don't get paid and go on CBRE. So what can HR leaders do if in fact they're working for an organization that takes that perspective?
And it's both from today and for tomorrow.
For today and tomorrow. Yeah. That's a tough position to be in, right? Because you might have the best of intentions, but if you're not supported, right, by your organization in terms of carrying out those intentions, that's a really tough spot to be in. And for sure, I empathize with you. I think, the best you can do, well, 2 things. You want to sort of do, all of those healthy things, right? Checking in with your team members, making sure they're okay, offering them whatever resources that you can, that are possible within the limits that the organization is placing upon you, right? So you want to model that as best you can. Is there anyone else, like, do you have an ally in that organization? Is there anyone else that you can speak to about what's happening or what's not happening? Is there anyone who could help you maybe to, carry out those plans within some of the limits that are being placed upon you? So try as best you can in terms of what's actually in your control to do what you can to take care of your team members. Look for allies or, the helpers in your organization, ideally, at your peer level. I mean, that's the best that you can do, right? And then at the end of the day, if you're working for an organization that you feel your values are not aligning to that organization, then I think that's a bigger decision that needs to be made, that I can't weigh upon. It's so individual, but I would say try and do what you can with the limits that you have, so that if let's say one day if you decide, say, to leave the organization, you can leave and feel good about what you did or what you tried to do within the limits that you had.
I'm sure the people on the call, I'm getting a lot of people I know calling me up for advice who are in that kind of situation. I'm sure many people on the call are having that kind of situation, trying to help others.
And Barry, is your question more around advice to talk to that particular leader or CEO who takes that perspective?
I was looking more towards what are we going to do when everything gets back to normal and people come back? Because what Mark Cuban said, the 10 years is so accurate. What companies are doing today are going to have far-fetching issues. And if you're not looking after your people today, they will remember. All you have to do is go take a look at your local bank, and virtually everybody's in there working. You're kind of wondering, why are they there? They're on the phone. Couldn't half of them be out? And sort of what's the story? What's the signal that the banks are sending to their employees?
Yeah. Okay, so we've reached the top of the hour, and I don't want to take more time than we're so lucky to have with Gina. Gina, thank you so much. Is there a way that people can reach out to you? I know that you have services at MedCan. What would be the best way if people wanted to follow up?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to communicate there. I am at MedCan, still working, as I said, very, very much so. If you yourselves maybe are struggling or find that even as a one-off you want to talk to somebody, I'm happy to do so. We're doing everything this way now, virtually, until we return back to work. But yeah, I'm happy to speak to you as well. Reach out, but LinkedIn or just my email. It's first name, last name. So you see it there on the screen. So Gina di Giulio all together @medcan.com. Feel free, if you have any other questions, I'm happy to answer them. Just send them my way. Don't be shy. Happy to be of further help even after today.
Yeah, Gina, we're very, very grateful. Thank you. I didn't even realize when we were talking, this is Mental Health Week, so it's well timed. And I think the link to CAMH and to the Canadian Mental Health Association is really great. And I'm sure some people will follow up with you because it's a really big question that we in the community have been asking ourselves. Yeah. And I've also been asking the HR leaders, how are you taking care of yourself? Because they're on the front lines absorbing all of this from frightened employees. So yeah, it's been great. Thank you very, very much. Really grateful.
My pleasure.
Have
all right.
Take
care, everyone.
Buddy.